again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a look at the IndiaFoxtEcho Sukhoi SU-31. The aircraft released recently and IndiaFoxtEcho have been putting out some nice products for the sim to date. This one is a little bit cheaper than their usual output, so I think it's going to be interesting to see what we get for our money. Today's flight is going to be a review of the aircraft, however we are going to run things in a slightly more condensed format than usual. We're currently on the ground at Brisbane's Archerfield airport. We're going to be heading out towards the Brisbane CBD, and we'll be putting the aircraft around the freeware Orbx Brisbane River Run. For those who aren't familiar, the Orbx Brisbane River Run is a Red Bull styled pylon racing event through the city of Brisbane following the course of the river. I thought it would be a good test of the SU-31, and we actually ran the course previously in the default Extra 330 within the sim. So on top of comparing the aircraft's performance here today, we can also compare the two aircraft. And given that the two aircraft are very similar in nature, of course though one comes free with the sim, it should be a good way of figuring out whether or not the SU-31 is worth splashing out on, or whether or not the default 330 will fulfill the job for most of you. As I say, the flight is going to be in a condensed format, so we'll carry out a full startup, we'll get the aircraft airborne and head out towards the Brisbane CBD. We'll put the aircraft around the course, we're then going to watch that back cinematically to give you a bit more of a feel for the external modelling of the aircraft. And then as we head home back towards Archerfield, we're going to break down the aircraft with my usual thoughts and opinions on the product. As always guys, I do hope you enjoy the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Let's now head for the cockpit of the Sukhoi 31 and we'll get our flight underway. So welcome to the cockpit of the IndiaFoxtEcho Sukhoi SU-31. Once again, a very nice effort from them, the modelling very well done, you can see lots of detailing there, including the wiring looms around the cockpit. Texturing much the same, very crisp, very clear textures. There are just a couple of exceptions, for example the warning lights there, we'll look at those again later on, but they look a bit strange in terms of texturing. And overall I would say there are just a couple of little details that don't look quite as realistic as they do on some other IndiaFoxtEcho aircraft. Anyway, as I said, we're going to carry out a quick startup and run up, so running through our before start checks, the flight controls. You can see we've got those big old aerobatic ailerons there on the wings. Flight controls are full free and in the correct sense. Trim is set to neutral. Throttle is set to idle, properly reset fully forward. Canopy, we'll close that up after the start, that way we can hear the startup sounds a little bit better. Fuel quantities, we've got 50% in both the main and the wing tanks. Interestingly there you can see the gauge is not quite showing the 50% mark, which is what we do have fueled up in the sim. Flight instruments are checked, the altimeter is set, the QNH currently 1016. Accelerometers have been reset, battery can go on. According to the checklist we're looking for a minimum of 24 volts. Interestingly they're not reading any deflection on the needle on the gauge. I would assume in reality that the inner scale there is voltage. That could be user error on my part, but looks like there's maybe a little bit of a bug. Warning lights we can test. And as I said, the warning lights there I don't think look particularly great in terms of texturing. Nonetheless, the warning lights are checked. So we'll be starting on the battery, we don't have any ground power available, not using the radio for the flight today. Generator can go on. Fuel shut-off valve is in the open position. Throttle we'll set about 1/3 forward. Prop pitch is set to high RPM. Engine gills are closed. We'll prime the engine. Just checking the prop area, making sure no one's in front of the prop arc. We'll give everyone a shout. Clear prop! Wheel chocks are in place, ground crew have been advised. Magnetos can go on. And we'll hit the starter. So we do have a good start there, the engine catches quite aggressively as you'll have seen on the instruments. There's no suggested idle setting, it just says to come up on the power until we have smooth running, so we'll go for about 30% for the time being. Engine temperatures and pressures, my Russian isn't particularly great, but I'm sure one of those two is oil pressure. Everything's nicely in the green, the oil temperature's just coming up. Same for the cylinder head temperature there. As I say, we'll carry out a quick run up just in our present position, so coming fully back on the stick, we'll come up to 70%. So there's our 70%, prop is set fully forward, we're holding here on the brakes. Engine temperatures and pressures look good, we'll check the magnetos. So onto the right mag, and you can see there we've got a drop. And now onto the left. Same there on the left. And back to both, we're back up to our 70%. Cycling the prop. We do have a drop there in RPM. And same again. And we'll come all the way now back towards idle. Overall, and I'm not sure whether or not it's true to life, but the engine does behave quite digitally. It certainly doesn't seem to have much nuance to it. And the engine sounds at idle as well. They may well be accurate, I have no idea, but they really remind me of the default Stop with Camel from FS2000. They're a little bit rattly. Anyway, idling around 25%. Temperatures and pressures still looking good. We'll come back up to our 30. Yeah, the engine sounds internally, they're okay at high power. They didn't blow me away. I was expecting to be quite impressed. Externally, the aircraft sounds okay. And it has to be said that IndiaFoxtEcho's previous products, the sounds have been a weakness in some areas. For example, T45 sounds were nothing particularly stellar. Anyway, we do have a good start. We'll close up the canopy. Slightly jerky animation there on the canopy. But you can hear we do have a change in sound. Anyway, we'll now make our way out towards the runway and we'll get this baby airborne. So we are just approaching the start of the run. We'll firewall the throttle and let's go. So building up some speed here in the descent, just come up through about 380 kilometers an hour. Over the start line we'll start the stopwatch and through the first of the double gates, a little bit of a slalom section initially. Overall the SU-31 incredibly responsive on the controls as you'd expect. Perhaps not quite as crisp though overall in terms of handling as I was expecting. A little bit more wallowy. Anyway, through the first of the slalom sections, out through a double pylon. And cutting it nice and fine here just to keep us relatively short in terms of track distance. Overall I would say yes, that the SU-31, a little bit default in terms of how the aircraft feels to fly. I think some of that may actually be the sounds. They rather, given that the aircraft uses default sounds, it rather tricks one's brain into the aircraft very much feeling like a default aircraft. But to me it doesn't feel hugely different from the default extra 330 that we get in the sim. It is very easy to fly though, as you can see. Overall very responsive, very capable of completing the course. So first section complete, again just slaloming our way through single pylon section. We'll get a little bit of a breather just up ahead. And back through some double pylons, as I said, a little bit of time to breathe just as we come around the corner. So far so good from the SU-31. And getting the aircraft straightened up to come through the double pylons. Needs to come out to the left of the pylon just off the nose. So again the aircraft is very capable in terms of manoeuvrability. Quite easy to lose at low speeds. The wing will snap, you will go into a stall or even a spin. And it does bleed off energy fairly quickly when pulling some high G loads, I have tended to find. Up through another set of double pylons. Keeping the aircraft nice and low here to come through the bridge. We'll just cut the throttle momentarily as we squeeze through the gap, back up on the throttle. Throttle response is reasonable, but again the engine just feels very instantaneous in terms of its response. It really feels like the needles there on the engine gauges more or less respond to your throttle input. There's no lag in the system, no nuance like you'd see on an A2A aircraft or even some of the moderate fidelity aircraft that we've seen in the sim to date. Really having to reef back on the controls there just to make that turn. Coming up towards the halfway mark now, jumping over the first of the bridges. You'll see that the photogrammatic bridges are not modelled entirely accurately. We can't fly under some of them, which later on in the run we should be doing. So we'll just carry out a few of our own little manoeuvres there as we come through the bridge section. For example, here you can see we should be going underneath the next bridge, but that's not going to be an option for us, so we'll just go into a loop just to see how the aircraft feels in pitch. And overall, very much the same as it feels in roll. It's not bad by any means, but it doesn't feel particularly special in terms of flight modelling. Again, broadly feels like a default aircraft. And we'll go for an aileron roll. That's not full deflection there, but full deflection is pretty instantaneous. Again, as you'd expect from the SU-31. Coming up on the last section now, again, a bit of a slaloming section. Just to finish up the run. You do have to get more aggressive now on the turns as we come through the single pylons. And really having to cut in close here to make sure that we do actually get back in time for the next section of the run. So coming through the last couple of pylons there and finishing up our run. Overall very enjoyable, but again for me the aircraft doesn't feel hugely different to the default Extra 330, but nonetheless a good fun aircraft. I do like the cockpit, and of course we'll discuss a little bit more about it as we head home.
So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our attempt around the Orbx Brisbane River Run. We managed a time of 3 minutes 41.26 seconds in the SU-31, and that's versus a time of 3 minutes 52.5 in the Extra 330. So we were nearly a full 10 seconds quicker in the Sukhoi. Worth noting though there, we're not comparing apples with apples, as the runs were slightly different. The scenery was slightly different there between the two runs, so whilst in the Extra 330 we did actually carry out the bridge section, here of course we carried out our own aerobatic manoeuvres. Nonetheless, I do feel that the Sukhoi does have a slight edge over the Sim's default Extra 330. As I mentioned during the run, I do feel that both aircraft handled in a broadly similar fashion, and the Sukhoi 31 did have a slightly default Microsoft Flight Simulator feel to it. Nevertheless, it did feel a little bit easier to control, a little bit more responsive, and it did seem to behave a little bit better at high Gs as well. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, as we make our way home, I'll break down the product, give you a few of my positives and negatives. Overall, I will say that the Sukhoi 31 is a nice offering from IndiaFoxtEcho, but I don't necessarily think the product is up to their usual standards. Then again, of course, the pricing is lower as well, so that's perhaps to be expected. Anyway, in terms of my negatives, the main one for me there really was the flight model. Again, not bad per se, it felt about right for that type of an aircraft, but again it did feel quite similar to the default Extra 330. Given that we do already have a capable, powerful aerobatic aircraft by default within the sim, really of course you'd be wanting to see the flight model of the third-party add-on surpassing that. The aircraft is pretty responsive on the controls, but it did feel a little bit more wallowy than I was expecting. Certainly when you see the guys flying these sorts of aircraft at Red Bull events, the control response is very crisp, very precise. Of course some of that will come down to pilot skill, but overall I do think that the flight model, not quite what I was expecting from the SU-31. The takeoff again felt very typical of a Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft. The aircraft was very sensitive on the rudder. Response there didn't feel particularly great, and once again the torque and the P factor produced by the engine tended to kick in rather more instantaneously than you might expect. The same goes with the landing, nothing awful there, but again it could have just as easily been a default aircraft that I was flying. So as far as the flight model goes, very much down the middle, by no means anything spectacular, but also nothing bad. Systems were much the same. Most of the systems on the aircraft seemed to work, but it did feel pretty lightweight in terms of the systems modelling, in as much as it didn't really feel like there was a whole lot going on behind the scenes. We've already spoken about the engine response, for example. That really feels like a piece of coding. You can really see the engine respond to throttle inputs pretty much instantaneously. It's a little bit hard to describe perhaps, but I'm sure that many of you know what I'm getting at, in as much as the aircraft feels like a coded aircraft as opposed to a real, living, breathing machine. Sounds I thought were a mixed bag. Again, I'll leave you to judge the sounds for yourselves, broadly speaking, as it always seems to divide opinion. For me personally, I quite like the sounds at high power settings. I thought the external sounds were good. At low power settings though, I thought the engine sounded rather odd. That could be true to life, but again it sounded rather rattly. There didn't seem to be much bass note there. And I think for me one of the letdowns with the sounds is we could definitely hear those default Sobo sounds throughout all of our manoeuvres. The default sounds in Microsoft Flight Simulator are certainly above average, but I don't want to keep hearing them in third-party add-ons. I'm not sure whether or not the fault there lies with developers or with the Sobo themselves, but those default sounds really sound out of place in a lot of aircraft that they get used in. It really breaks the immersion, and as I said, for me throughout the flight it really tricked my brain, perhaps even into thinking that the aircraft felt more default than it actually did. Last couple of negative points for the product. I did have one crash to desktop whilst I was using it, which is pretty unusual in the sim. Given that it was just one, I ordinarily wouldn't mention it, but of course when we ran the review of the F-35 from IndiaFoxtEcho, crash to desktop issues were quite a big problem there. It was just the one crash to desktop though after many hours of running the product, so it may have just been an unlucky situation on that particular front. And my last minor gripe with the Sukhoi 31, and really I'm a little bit of a victim of my own words here, having said the opposite about Carenado products. I'm not a big fan of the pilot avatar, and now I suppose I know how all of the lady simmers amongst us feel, because the avatar is of course a female pilot. Myself not being one, it would have been nice perhaps to have the choice there. Anyway, that just about wraps up my negatives. In terms of the positives, overall once again from IndiaFoxtEcho, the Sukhoi 31 is modelled and textured very nicely. Again, perhaps just shy of their usual standards, particularly internally. I thought the cockpit looked great for the most part, but I did feel that the gauges looked slightly cartoonish there with the colouring bands on them. Otherwise though, a very nicely rendered example of the aircraft. The strength of the add-on for me was really the cockpit. I like the styling, I like overall as well having the steam gauges versus the Extra 330, of course having the glass cockpit. Of course the SU-31 also offers excellent visibility, and ultimately it's a really enjoyable aircraft to throw around, to have some fun in, to pull some manoeuvres. It's certainly a good option for these sorts of runs. It's also quite a nice option for practicing your aerobatics in the sim. So for the most part the product definitely has the fun factor box ticked off. It's nice that we have smoke as well, although the smoke effects weren't particularly brilliant, but I assume that's a current issue with the sim as opposed to the product. Overall I did enjoy my time in the aircraft. For me it really felt like it sat though somewhere between a default aircraft and one of IndiaFoxtEcho's usual products. But I do think for the price it's a very fair offering overall, and I'm sure you'll get some fun out of the aircraft if you pick it up. Anyway guys, once again I do hope you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. If you did, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel and you've yet to do so, then please consider subscribing as well. As ever, a huge thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. It's very much appreciated. I hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.